On this Sunday night, did Canadians heed warnings to stay home for the holidays? Were the lockdown measures enough to curb the rise in COVID cases?
The next week will tell us.
And what will be the full impact of Christmas and New Year's? Growing calls for Ontario to ramp up protection for long-term care residents.
I didn't know how bad it was until actually being in it.
Global National with Robin Gill. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. The holiday period is coming to an end, and health officials across the country are bracing for a possible spike in COVID-19 cases. Today, Quebec released its first numbers of the year, and they're grim. The province recorded more than 7,600 new cases since New Year's Eve. Nearly 2,900 of them were recorded in the last 24 hours, a new single-day record. Ontario's numbers are still the highest in the country, with close to 3,000 new cases. Despite strict rules over the holiday period in many parts of the country, health experts are worried many Canadians may not have listened. Mike Armstrong has our top story tonight.
Downtown Montreal in lockdown. The city's core deserted in what will be a decisive week. Quebec's new COVID-19 numbers released Sunday are among the worst since the pandemic started, an average of 2,500 new cases over 3 days. But despite that, they're not quite as bad as many expected. Dr. Gilbert Boucher is the head of Quebec's Association of Emergency Medicine Specialists.
I guess it's good in the sense it's not going up, but it's bad in the sense that it's not coming lower down.
The question now is where the numbers go from here. Were the lockdown measures effective? In much of the country, people were told to avoid family gatherings, multiple households getting together over the holidays. Well, Dr. Boucher says patients don't admit it at first, but many of the COVID cases he's seeing are coming from family gatherings.
Most people had some kind of an exposure, left or right. People believe that nobody's infected in their family, and that's unfortunately not the case.
Now, the full impact of Christmas and New Year's is still days away. In Ontario, the lockdown may have helped plateau the numbers, and that plateau is very high, but health officials are watching to see what happens in 1 or 2 incubation periods.
I'm not discouraged at this point. I've seen it flattening, but again, the true story is going to come out over the next week or so.
One problem may be pandemic fatigue, people reaching a point where they let their guard down or break rules. The way to combat that, health officials say, may be to focus on the fact there's now a solution. Vaccines are being rolled out across the country.
I'm using that as an inspiration to get people be a bit more patient, because going into 2021 and we're there now, we're going to be seeing, I think, the beginning of the end of the pandemic.
If the numbers do jump in January, provincial governments will have to look at ways of extending their lockdowns or even expanding them, closing more than what's already shut down. They may also find it's not enough if people aren't following the rules anyway. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
Breaking news out of Ottawa tonight. More politicians not following the rules. 2 Liberal MPs have resigned from their additional parliamentary and government roles after traveling over the holidays. Samir Zuberi has stepped down from his parliamentary committee role after visiting his wife's ailing grandfather in Delaware. He returned to Canada on December 31st. Kamal Khera has also stepped down from her role as parliamentary secretary. She traveled to Seattle to be with her grieving family, returning on New Year's Eve. Both failed to notify the chief government whip before traveling abroad. The 2 join a growing list of politicians in hot water after ignoring public health advice to stay home over the holidays. Nowhere is the situation more dire than in some of Canada's long-term care homes. In Ontario, pressure mounts as COVID cases in those facilities continues to rise. Advocates and families are calling for immediate action, and they're looking to other parts of Canada for solutions. Morganne Campbell has more.
She dedicated 30 years of her life to working in long-term care. And on New Year's Eve, Sheila Yakovision passed away from COVID-19.
Wanted to take care of residents, as she's the one that couldn't take care of herself.
The 60-year-old worked at a Windsor long-term care home, one of the more than 200 in outbreak across Ontario, which has sparked several protests at homes like Tender Care Living Centre east of Toronto. 60 residents have died from the novel coronavirus, which has prompted an outcry from families and advocates demanding better conditions.
I didn't realize how hard it was to communicate with the government or to get their response.
Long-term care critics say the province isn't doing enough to help a sector that is in dire straits.
That is the result of either a lack of prioritization or a lack of understanding. And it's hard to imagine how it could possibly be a lack of understanding.
Canada's National Seniors Advocacy Organization says there are steps the province can take now to curb the spread of COVID-19 inside long-term care. Steps that include a hiring and mass training blitz in infection control and PPE usage, rapid response teams similar to what New Brunswick has done that are trained in containment and treatment of the virus, implement permanent infection and control experts in homes, make rapid testing available to those who live and work in long-term care, as evidence has shown that it is more than 70% effective and will help to screen out the virus and vaccinate.
There's been really good steps done by BC, Alberta, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Quebec that we could have been learning from.
To make sure that they had these safeguards in place ahead of what we knew and what was well predicted to be a more dangerous second wave.
In a statement to Global News, Ontario's Ministry of Long-Term Care says it is working to address some of the issues raised by advocates in this story, adding that it has invested $1 billion into long-term care resources. Morganne Campbell, Global News, Toronto.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is warning that stricter lockdown restrictions could be imposed in England as new COVID-19 variant pushes infection rates to record levels.
It may be that we need to do things in the next few weeks that will be tougher in many parts of the country. I'm fully reconciled to that.
The UK is in the midst of an acute outbreak, recording more than 50,000 new infections a day for the 6th day in a row. Emergency field hospitals built at the start of the pandemic are being reactivated to handle the expected surge in new cases, especially in London. Most of England is already at the highest Tier 4 level. Non-essential shops are closed and people may only leave their homes for a limited number of essential reasons. On Monday, residents across the UK will get their first shots of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Germany's health minister says that country will likely need to extend a national lockdown beyond January 10th. German police chased people off the slopes of a closed ski resort east of Dusseldorf today after hundreds flocked there. Germany imposed tougher social restrictions before Christmas, including closing restaurants and most shops. But infections continue to rise and the death toll has climbed to close to 1,000 some days. The U.S. has reached another grim pandemic milestone. More than 350,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. And there's growing concern that number will rise even further as infections surge across the country. More than 20 million Americans have tested positive for COVID-19. In California, a hospital is struggling to deal with a major COVID outbreak. At least 43 staff at a San Jose medical center have tested positive since last Sunday. All of them work in the emergency department. The hospital is still investigating the cause of the outbreak, but there are reports a staff member wearing an air-powered costume on Christmas may have contributed to the spread. Former talk show host Larry King is reported to be in hospital with COVID-19. CNN says King has been hospitalized for more than a week. The 87-year-old has had medical issues in recent years, including heart attacks, diabetes, and lung cancer. He also lost 2 of his children in 2020 within weeks of each other. Hospital protocols have kept King's family members from visiting. An eyebrow-raising recording has been released today from the Washington Post. On it, U.S. President Donald Trump apparently pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State to overturn election results in his state. Now, the recording comes before a contentious week on Capitol Hill. 11 Republican senators plan to contest the outcome of the U.S. presidential election when they count the electoral votes that declared Joe Biden president-elect. Jennifer Johnson reports.
Please raise your right hand.
As members of Congress are sworn into office, a bombshell recording from the Washington Post of U.S. President Donald Trump apparently pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find enough votes to overturn his defeat in that state.
And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
Georgia has counted its ballots 3 times. Each time, Joe Biden won. The recording comes as 11 GOP senators plan Wednesday to challenge the results of the Electoral College, electing Joe Biden as America's next president.
We are not acting to thwart the democratic process. We're acting to protect it. We have tens of millions of people that do not view this election result as legitimate.
The Department of Justice, FBI, and several court rulings have found no evidence of fraud in the election. Even most Republicans feel the senators' challenge will fail.
The reason it will go nowhere is because there's been no evidence of widespread fraud, and that's been determined by Republican and Democratic governors across the country, and so the facts are the facts.
God bless you. We love you, Mr. President.
In the Washington Post recording, the president also claims his loss in Georgia will hurt 2 Republican candidates in Tuesday's runoff election, which will determine the balance of power in the Senate. If the 2 Democrats win, the House, Senate, and White House will all be controlled by Democrats, the first time in 11 years.
This is a nail biter, and my hope is that Democrats will show up and demonstrate that November is the beginning of a pattern.
President Trump clearly still upset about what happened in November, and President-elect Biden plan to campaign for their party's candidates in Georgia Monday. Meanwhile, President Trump's loyalists plan to rally outside the White House Wednesday to support Senate Republicans challenging the election results. The president has tweeted he plans to attend that event. Colleen?
Jennifer Johnson in Washington. Thanks, Jennifer. Coming up, Iran isn't ruling out further revenge as the country marks the anniversary of a U.S. assassination. One year ago today, a U.S. drone strike killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, and the world braced itself for the fallout. Those fears were realized 5 days later when Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was shot down by an Iranian missile, killing 176 people. Almost half of the victims were Canadian citizens or permanent residents. But as Redmond Shannon reports, Iran says its revenge for Soleimani's death isn't over yet.
Across Iran, the government is making sure citizens can't forget Qasem Soleimani. The general's assassination at the hands of a U.S. drone strike made him an instant martyr. Martyr Soleimani always stood against ISIS, says this Tehran woman. He was the only one who could do so. This weekend has seen events across Iran to mark the anniversary of his death. Protests too in Iraq, where he was killed.
The #1 terrorist anywhere in the world, Qasem Soleimani.
U.S. President Donald Trump ordered the strike after a series of attacks on American bases in Iraq carried out by Iranian-backed militias. Those strikes continued after the assassination, until 5 days later, when 2 Iranian missiles hit Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752. 176 civilians were killed, including 55 Canadian citizens and 30 permanent residents. Iran first denied involvement, eventually claiming it was human error. It says indictments are expected this month. It recently allocated $150,000 to each of the victims' families. Canada says compensation should be negotiated and has rejected Tehran's explanation for the cause. This weekend, the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps repeated a threat that Iran is not done with revenge.
If you're sitting in Tehran, if you're mulling over your options for revenge, the reality is that you have very limited options.
Iran's foreign minister has also warned Trump to be careful of a trap before he leaves office, claiming Israel is plotting against US targets in the region to trick the US into war with Iran. It's something Israel has denied, even if US intervention is what they might want.
Trump has been renowned for being averse to war, drawing down troops, promising to bring the boys home, lambasting US interventions in the past. It's hard to imagine he would throw all that away just to spite Biden.
President-elect Joe Biden wants the US back in the Iran nuclear deal, likely subject to a renegotiation. Trump pulled out of the plan in 2018. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Still ahead, the soulful investment that's keeping some people a step ahead. Just one of many videos by Canadian figure skater Elaj Balde that's taking social media by storm. The former competitive skater has gone viral with videos of his high-flying moves garnering millions of views and shared by celebrities like Jada Pinkett Smith. And to think, he almost didn't put on skates in the first place.
My mom was a figure skater when she was in Russia. She had to stop skating at a very young age, but she had the passion for it and instilled it in me. But I hated skating when I started. I tried to hide my skates and tell my mom I lost my skates. I tried to do everything not to skate, but she was very committed.
Balde went on to compete internationally for Team Canada. Now retired, he says he wants his videos to showcase experimental styles beyond traditional figure skating, hoping they inspire other skaters to do the same. The pandemic has really kicked our economy, but one industry hasn't missed a step. In fact, it's growing by leaps and bounds. As Brianna Karsten-Smith reports, collectors are proving sneakers aren't just shoes.
Forget about coins, stamps, and even vintage wines. The growing trend in collecting has a whole lot of soul.
Kids treat them as stocks now.
With some pairs of sneakers going for 5 figures, analysts are predicting the industry could be worth more than $95 billion by 2025. But for many collectors, the obsession actually starts with wanting to be like Mike.
Like Mike, if I could be like Mike.
Definitely nostalgia for me. Because you were able to buy the shoes that you watched Michael Jordan play in back in those days, right?
Jensen Joe and Francisco Rodas help run the Edmonton Sneakerheads Facebook group. Each have almost 100 pairs. They say a recent documentary about the NBA legend has inspired more collectors. And while Alberta's sneaker sales and resale markets don't fall into step with parts of the U.S., they are growing.
I feel it's smaller, but I feel like the community sense is stronger.
For 21 years, Fouche has been part of that community.
Our main goal was to bring stuff to Edmonton that nobody else was bringing in.
At one point, Justin Durr owned more than 1,000 pairs.
I was wearing artwork on my feet.
And the growing interest is keeping his business alive when so many others are struggling. There have been challenges. Large conventions have been canceled, and usually when an exclusive and limited edition shoe is released, people show up hours before the store opens to get their foot in the door.
Having the lineups, it allows us to interact with the people that are buying the shoes. And that's something that we're passionate about, obviously the shoes themselves, but it's really nice to talk to somebody about the product and maybe learn about their history, collecting, what got them into it.
Still, sneakerheads are getting creative. Rodas customizes his sneakers now, the local teacher using it as a mix of an art lesson and history class.
They're always asking me, oh, like, when can you paint my shoes next? Or can you, and I said, well, if you do really good in this semester or in this grade, then maybe I might, we went work out something or just something, right, to motivate them.
For anyone wanting their own lesson in collecting, these experts say just like wine, vintage is better.
Do your research. I mean, there's so many ways you can get to know the history behind the designs.
A hobby you can put your own stamp on that can bring in some serious coin.
How much do these go for, Mac?
Oh, I don't know, too much. Probably around three grand.
What? Brianna Karsten-Smith, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Sunday. I'm Colleen Christie. Tonight's Your Canada is the picturesque Mont Saint-Hilaire in Quebec. If you'd like to share your Canada with us, please email your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching and have a good night.